Let's take a moment to look at some of the Photoshop preferences. I want to make sure that throughout these demos, we're looking at the same options and that Photoshop behaves the same for all of us. In addition, I want to point out some options that will enable us to work smarter. In order to access our preferences, I'll use the Photoshop menu and then choose Preferences and General. If you're on Windows, you'll want to go under the Edit menu and then choose Preferences and General. The first two options that I want to make sure we have enabled is the ability to resize image during place and always create smart objects when placing. By default, these should be turned on, but if they've been turned off, please enable them by checking on the little box to the left. What this is going to enable us to do when we're creating our composites is drag an image from Bridge onto an open document in Photoshop and have Photoshop automatically resize the image to the same size as our canvas. In addition, once we place the image, Photoshop's going to turn that image into a smart object automatically. Now let's take a look at the interface preferences. The first thing that I want to point out is that I'm using the second color theme from the left. In fact, since you're watching this movie on Photoshop preferences, I'm going to show you a cool little hidden shortcut. If you hold down the Command key and the Option key and the Shift key on Mac, that would be the Control, Alt, Shift key on Windows, and you click in any one of these color swatches, it will toggle you either to 4 different kinds of coffee, or if we click again with that same keyboard shortcut held down, and then click one more time, we'll get 4 different choices for bread. So it's a very cute shortcut. I'm not sure that we're going to be using that for anything of true value, but now you know that it's there. All right, I'll click one more time so we return back to our gray swatches. All right, before we leave interface, I want to make sure that the Open Documents as Tabs is enabled. When it's enabled and you open, say, 5 or 6 images that you want to combine into a single composite, this will keep all of those images nice and tidy across the top. And in fact, we're going to create a custom keyboard shortcut, which will easily allow us to navigate back and forth between seeing all of our open documents and just a single document. All right, now we're going to move to the File Handling tab. I want to point out that I have enabled the Save As to Original Folder preference. What this allows Photoshop to do is, when saving a file, save it back to where it came from. So as we walk through these demos, we won't have to do as much navigation. If you uncheck it, then Photoshop relies on the operating system, and typically the operating system will take you back to the last saved folder, as opposed to the folder from where the image originated. Moving down to this area here in File Compatibility, there's an option to maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility, and it's typically set to Ask. I'm going to change that to Always because I always want to make sure that my Photoshop files, my PSD and my PSB files, have the maximum amount of compatibility with other programs like Lightroom. If you change this to Never, you will get a smaller file size, but applications like Lightroom won't be able to work with the file. Moving down to the performance preferences. This is kind of a small one, but it was really noticeable for me in the most current versions of Photoshop and when I went to the Retina display. When I use the pen tool, it draws paths that are very nice and thin and anti-aliased, but they're a little bit difficult for me to see. If you go into the advanced settings, there's an option to uncheck anti-alias guides and paths. Now my guides and paths won't be as smooth. They're going to be a little bit chunkier, but because they're chunkier, they're easier for me to see. And while we're right here in the history and cache area, I just want to point out that this is how you control the number of history states that you have to go back through in case you make a mistake. The reason I want to point this out is because as we work with composites, our files can become very large. And if you're limited with the amount of disk space that Photoshop can use as its scratch disk, it might actually fill up that space, in which case you could come in here and lower the history states. For now, let's go ahead and leave it set to 20. Moving down to transparency and gamut, the way that Photoshop typically represents transparency in a layered document is by this checkerboard over here on the right. but I find that checkerboard can be quite distracting, so I prefer to turn it off. When we change the grid size to none, you can see that there's no longer a checkerboard, and when you're viewing your multi-layered document, Photoshop will view that even if it doesn't have a background layer, as if it was flattened to white. Moving to guides, grids, and slices, I think it's really helpful to know that as we drag in our guides, say for example, we might want to divide our image into thirds, those guides do not have to be cyan. We can either select a different color from the list, we can click Custom, or you'll notice over to the right, your guides, your smart guides, and your grids all have color swatches that you can click to adjust them. So I prefer to not have any color in my guides. Instead, I'll click and drag in the color picker in order to select a darker but neutral gray. Excellent. I'll click OK and OK again. And now we're all on the same page and we'll see the same options as we move forward throughout these demos.